The harsh wind carried the echo of whispers through Jordan Valley, Oregon, as 19-year-old Sarah Blackburn stood trembling on the church steps, her wedding dress billowing around her ankles like a white flag of surrender. The murmurs of the townsfolk stung worse than the dust whipping across her tear-streaked face as Reverend Thornton's words rang in her ears. "I cannot in good conscience marry a child. Come back when you're of a proper age." "I am of proper age," Sarah protested, her voice breaking. "I'm 19 years old." In this town, decent young ladies wait until they are at least 21, especially when marrying a man of such standing as Mr. Willoughby. The Reverend replied sternly, eyeing the groom who stood awkwardly beside her. Harold Willoughby, the bank owner's son, 15 years her senior. Harold shifted his weight, clearing his throat. "Perhaps the Reverend is right, Sarah. We can wait a couple more years. But we've been courting for nearly a year." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Their wedding had been planned for months, the invitations sent, her modest dress sewn by her own hands. "Your father should have known better than to consent to this," Reverend Thornton added with a disapproving frown. "Times are changing, and young girls rushing into marriage is becoming quite unseemly." Sarah looked desperately toward her father, who stood among the crowd. Thomas Blackburn, a weathered rancher who had raised her alone since her mother's death, merely dropped his gaze to his worn boots. His silence was a betrayal that cut deeper than the Reverend's refusal. The wedding guests began to disperse, whispers growing into bolder gossip that floated through the crisp autumn air. Harold's mother took her son's arm, pulling him away with barely concealed relief, while Sarah stood frozen, humiliation burning her cheeks redder than the setting sun. "Come along, Sarah," her father finally said, approaching with outstretched hand. "We'll head home now." "No." She stepped back, clutching her bouquet of wildflowers so tightly that stems snapped between her fingers. "How could you let them do this? You gave your blessing." From the edge of the crowd, a tall figure strode forward. Samuel Lawson, a cowboy who worked at the neighboring ranch, moved with the confidence of a man who'd faced down stampeding cattle and survived harsh winters alone on the range. His dark Stetson cast a shadow over eyes that had seen far more than his 25 years should allow. "Excuse me," Samuel's voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. "May I speak plainly, Reverend?" The crowd hushed, and even Sarah's sobs quieted at the unexpected interruption. "Mr. Lawson, this is hardly your concern," the Reverend replied stiffly. "With respect, sir, I believe it is." Samuel removed his hat, revealing unruly dark hair that caught the late afternoon light. "Miss Blackburn is of legal age to marry in the Oregon Territory, has been for 3 years now, according to territorial law." "We follow moral law in this town, young man, not just legal technicalities," Reverend Thornton bristled. "Moral law?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Was it moral law that let Mr. Peterson marry his wife when she was 18 last spring? Or perhaps when Mayor Wilson's daughter married at 17 with your blessing?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the onlookers. Sarah stared at the cowboy in disbelief. Samuel Lawson had barely spoken 2 words to her in all the times they'd crossed paths in town, yet here he stood, challenging the Reverend on her behalf. "That was different," the Reverend protested weakly. "Different because their fathers had more money or influence." Samuel's words weren't loud, but they carried weight. "Or different because their grooms weren't 15 years older than them." Harold Willoughby's face flushed crimson. "Now see here, Lawson." "No, you see here," Samuel interrupted, turning to face the crowd. "This isn't about age. This is about certain folks deciding who's good enough for whom based on standing and money." Sarah watched in amazement as the cowboy stood tall, his weathered hands gripping his hat before him. "You know what I think, Reverend. I think if Miss Blackburn truly wants to marry, she shouldn't be stopped by arbitrary rules that seem to bend for some but not others. And what business is it of yours?" Harold finally found his voice, stepping forward with indignation. Samuel turned to Sarah, his eyes softening as they met hers. "It's my business because I can't stand by watching injustice happen to someone who deserves better." He turned back to the Reverend. "I'll stand with you, Miss Blackburn, if you'll have my support." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Sarah looked from Samuel to Harold, who was now shifting uncomfortably under his mother's glare. Harold wouldn't meet her eyes, and in that moment, Sarah realized something she had been too blind to see. The man she'd agreed to marry didn't love her enough to fight for her. "I appreciate your support, Mr. Lawson," she finally said, her voice steadier than she expected. "But I believe the wedding is off regardless." She turned to Harold, removing the simple silver ring from her finger. "Not because I'm too young, but because I deserve someone who will stand beside me when it matters." She placed the ring in Harold's palm, turned and walked down the church steps with as much dignity as she could muster. Samuel fell into step beside her, offering his arm when they reached the street. "May I escort you home, Miss Blackburn?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she answered, surprised by her own certainty. "I believe you may." Behind them, the gossiping crowd erupted into fresh whispers, but for the first time that day, Sarah didn't care what they were saying. The ride back to the Blackburn ranch was mostly silent. Sarah sat rigid beside Samuel on his wagon, the wedding dress she had sewn with such hope now a painful reminder of her public humiliation. Her father had attempted to convince her to ride with him, but Sarah had refused, a quiet defiance in her tear-streaked face. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said as they approached the long drive leading to her home. The afternoon sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the valley in amber hues. "I know," Samuel replied simply, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But it wasn't right what they did back there." "You'll be the talk of the town now," Sarah warned, glancing at his profile. Up close, she noticed the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow and the way the corners of his eyes crinkled even when he wasn't smiling. Samuel shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time. Don't much care what people say when they're wrong." "How did you know? About the other marriages, I mean. I pay attention." He slowed the horses as they approached the ranch house. "People don't notice cowhands much. We're just part of the landscape to them, which means we see and hear things others don't." The wagon came to a stop, and Samuel set the brake before coming around to help Sarah down. Her hand felt small in his calloused palm, and she was suddenly conscious of how different this man was from Harold Willoughby with his soft hands and tailored suits. "Thank you," she said, reluctant to let go. "Not just for the ride. Miss Blackburn, Sarah, please, Sarah." Her name sounded different on his lips, somehow more substantial. "I meant what I said back there. If you need someone to stand with you, I will." The front door of the ranch house opened, and her father appeared, his expression a mixture of concern and lingering embarrassment. "I should go in," Sarah said, finally withdrawing her hand. "Will I see you again, Mr. Lawson?" "Samuel," he corrected with the hint of a smile. "And yes, I expect you will." As Samuel drove away, Sarah faced her father with newfound resolve. The day had not gone as planned, but somehow, standing on her own porch in a wedding dress without a wedding, she felt something unexpected stirring inside her, something that felt surprisingly like freedom. The following weeks in Jordan Valley passed with excruciating slowness for Sarah. The whispers followed her through town. Whenever she ventured from the ranch, hushed conversations that died as she approached. Pitying glances from women who had once envied her engagement to one of the town's most eligible bachelors, and the occasional outright snub from Harold Willoughby's family and friends. October turned to November, and the first frost painted the valley in silver. Sarah threw herself into ranch work with a determination that surprised even her father. The physical labor feeding livestock, mending fences, and helping with the fall slaughter left her too exhausted most nights to dwell on her humiliation. It was during the third week, after the wedding, that wasn't when Samuel Lawson appeared at their gate again. Sarah was in the barn, brushing down her father's horse after a morning ride, when she heard the distinctive creak of the gate followed by hoofbeats on the hard, packed earth. "Miss Blackburn," Samuel called, his deep voice echoing in the barn's rafters. Sarah stepped out from behind the horse, hay dust clinging to her simple work dress and hair that had escaped its practical braid. "Mr. Lawson," she replied, surprised at how her heart quickened. "What brings you to our ranch today?" Samuel removed his hat, revealing hair that had grown a little longer since she'd last seen him. "I came to speak with your father, actually. Is he about?" He rode into Boys for supplies. Won't be back till tomorrow. Sarah set down her brush and wiped her hands on her apron. Can I help with something? A moment of uncertainty crossed Samuel's face. I was hoping to speak with him about a business matter, but it can wait. He seemed to consider his options, then added, though while I'm here, I wondered if you might like to accompany me to the mercantile. Mrs. Peterson is selling those cinnamon buns you favor today. Sarah blinked in surprise. How did you know I favor Mrs. Peterson's cinnamon buns? A hint of color touched Samuel's sun-weathered cheeks. I've seen you buying them on Thursdays when I'm in town for supplies. Always noticed how you save the middle part for last. The fact that he had noticed such a small detail about her habits made something warm unfurl in Sarah's chest. No one, not even Harold during their year-long courtship, had paid such careful attention to her preferences. I would like that, she decided, removing her apron. Let me just clean up a bit and leave a note for our ranch hand. 20 minutes later, they were riding side by side toward town, Sarah on her own mare rather than sitting beside Samuel in his wagon. The November air was crisp but not uncomfortable, and the mountains in the distance wore their first dusting of snow like a white crown. People will talk, you know, Sarah said as they neared town. Being seen with me so soon after, well, everything. Samuel gave her a sidelong glance. Let them talk. Most folks have short memories when it comes to gossip. Something new will come along soon enough. Not in Jordan Valley, Sarah replied with a humorless laugh. In this town, people remember slights and scandals for generations. My grandmother once told me that old Mrs. Hensley still wouldn't speak to the butcher's family because his grandfather outbid hers on a prize cow in 1819. This earned a genuine chuckle from Samuel. Then perhaps we should give them something worth remembering. When they reached town, Sarah was painfully aware of the stares that followed them as they hitched their horses outside the mercantile. Mrs. Wilson, the mayor's wife, was just exiting the store and nearly dropped her packages at the sight of them together. Good day, Mrs. Wilson, Samuel said politely, tipping his hat as if nothing were amiss. The older woman looked between them, her expression a study in barely concealed scandal. Mr. Lawson, Miss Blackburn, what an unexpected pairing. Sarah lifted her chin slightly. Mr. Lawson was kind enough to escort me to town for some errands while my father is away. I see. The unspoken judgment in those two words was unmistakable. How thoughtful of him. As they entered the mercantile, Sarah felt her cheeks burning. I told you, she whispered to Samuel. This is why I've barely left the ranch in weeks. Pay it no mind, he replied, his hand briefly touching the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. People who matter don't mind, and people who mind don't matter. Inside, Mrs. Peterson was indeed selling her famous cinnamon buns, the sweet aroma filling the store and momentarily distracting Sarah from her discomfort. They purchased 2 buns and a few necessary supplies before venturing back outside, where they decided to eat their treats on a bench near the town's small park. You mentioned a business matter with my father, Sarah said, carefully tearing her bun into bite-sized pieces. May I ask what about? Samuel hesitated, then nodded. I've been saving for a few years now. The Double J Ranch is selling off their north section about 80 acres with good water access. I've made an offer, but I'm short on hands for the initial work. Was hoping your father might spare your ranch hand Miguel for a few weeks come spring, for fair wages, of course. Sarah's eyes widened. You're buying your own ranch, a small one, he clarified, but yes, been my plan since I first came west. That's wonderful, Samuel, she said genuinely. My father thinks highly of your work ethic. I'm sure he'll consider your request. They lapsed into comfortable silence, watching the occasional townsfolk pass by, some nodding politely while others pretended not to see them. Sarah found, to her surprise, that the stares bothered her less with Samuel beside her. Would you like to see it? Samuel asked suddenly. The land, I mean, it's not far. We could ride there and be back before dark. Sarah hesitated only briefly. I would like that very much. The north section of the Double J Ranch lay about 4 miles outside town, nestled against the foothills with a small creek cutting through its western edge. As they crested the final rise, Sarah caught her breath at the view. Rolling meadows dotted with stands of pine and aspen, Their leaves a brilliant gold against the azure sky. "It's beautiful," she murmured as Samuel led her to the property's highest point. "You can see all the way to the Snake River from here." Samuel nodded, his eyes alight with pride and possibility. "The soil's good for grazing and some farming. That creek never runs dry, even in August, and those trees will provide plenty of shelter for cattle in winter storms." "You've thought of everything," Sarah observed, watching him survey his future home with such obvious care. "Not everything," he admitted, turning to face her. "I know how to raise cattle and horses, can build a proper house and barn with my own hands, but a ranch needs more than that to be a home." Something in his tone made Sarah's heart beat faster. What else does it need? Life, family. His eyes held her steadily, someone to build it with. The weight of his words hung between them, full of unspoken possibility. Sarah broke their gaze first, overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings that had no business existing after such a short acquaintance. "It's getting late," she said softly. "We should head back." Samuel nodded, respecting her sudden reticence. As they mounted their horses, however, he added quietly, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable, Sarah. I just wanted you to know that not everyone in this valley thinks you're too young to know your own mind or heart." The ride back was quiet but not awkward, each lost in their own thoughts as the afternoon light faded toward evening. When they reached the Blackburn Ranch, Samuel insisted on seeing Sarah safely to her door. "Thank you for today," she said, lingering on the porch. "It was the first time I've felt normal since that day at the church. Thank you for coming with me." Samuel replaced his hat, his figure tall against the setting sun. "Would it be too forward to ask if I might call on you properly, with your father's permission, of course?" Sarah felt a smile, her first genuine one in weeks, spread across her face. "I don't think that would be forward at all, Mr. Lawson." As Samuel rode away, Sarah watched until he disappeared down the long drive. The day had brought unexpected comfort, and something else, a flickering hope that perhaps the humiliation at the church steps was not an ending but a beginning of something far more meaningful than she could have imagined. Thomas Blackburn returned from Boys the following afternoon, his wagon loaded with supplies and his expression grave as he greeted his daughter. "I ran into Harold Willoughby in Boys," he said without preamble as they unloaded sacks of flour and dried goods. "He's engaged again to Josephine Miller from Silver City. Her father owns half the mining rights in that county." Sarah paused, a sack of sugar in her arms, and assessed her own feelings at this news. To her surprise, she felt no jealousy or regret, only a vague sense of relief that Harold had found someone whose family connections better suited his ambitions. "That's good," she replied simply. "I hope they'll be happy." Her father studied her face carefully. "You're not upset?" "No," Sarah said, realizing it was true. "I think I'm actually grateful. If the Reverend had married us that day, I would have been tied to someone who didn't love me enough to stand up for me." Thomas nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology, Sarah. I should have spoken up that day at the church." "Should have defended you." "Yes, you should have," Sarah agreed, her tone firm but not unkind. "But someone else did, and that's what I wanted to discuss with you. Samuel Lawson stopped by yesterday." Her father's eyebrows rose. "Did he now? And what did the cowboy want?" Sarah explained about Samuel's land purchase and his request for Miguel's help in the spring. She deliberately omitted their trip to see the property, uncertain how her father would react to her spending time alone with a man so soon after her broken engagement. "Lawson's a good worker," Thomas conceded. "Been saving his wages for years, from what I hear. Never spends a cent on drink or gambling like most of the cowhands." "He asked your permission to call on me," Sarah added, watching her father's reaction carefully. Thomas set down the bag of coffee beans he was holding and turned to face his daughter fully. "And how do you feel about that?" "I'd like it if you said yes," she answered honestly. "He's a good man, Papa. He stood up for me when no one else would." Her father was quiet for a long moment. "He's not from money like the Willoughbys." "No, but he has plans and the determination to see them through, and he looks at me like—" Sarah paused, trying to find the right words. "Like he really sees me, not just a young girl to be married off or a rancher's daughter, but me." Thomas rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "He's what, 25? That's still a fair bit older than you." 6 years isn't 15, Sarah pointed out. And I'm not asking to marry him, Papa, just to get to know him better. After what seemed an eternity, Thomas nodded. Tell him he can call on Sunday after church. We'll see what kind of man he is when he's not playing hero on church steps. Sarah threw her arms around her father's neck. Thank you, Papa. Don't thank me yet, he grumbled, but his arms closed around her all the same. I still think you're too young to be thinking of courtship again so soon. I'm 19, not 9, Sarah reminded him gently. And this time, I'll be more careful with my heart. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a biting winter chill. Sarah spent far longer than usual selecting her dress for church, finally settling on a modest blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes and arranging her hair in a style that was neither too elaborate nor too plain. The church service was a trial of whispers and stares. Word of Harold's new engagement had reached Jordan Valley, and Sarah could feel the judgment in every glance. She sat beside her father with her back straight and her eyes forward, determined not to show how much it still hurt to be the subject of such cruel gossip. As the congregation filed out after the service, Sarah spotted Samuel standing near the gate, dressed in his Sunday best, a clean black suit that, while not new or fashionable, had been carefully pressed. Their eyes met across the churchyard, and his slow smile made her momentarily forget the whispers around her. Mr. Lawson, she greeted him formally as they approached, conscious of the watching crowd. Miss Blackburn, Mr. Blackburn. Samuel nodded respectfully to them both. Fine sermon today, wasn't it? Indeed, Thomas replied, assessing the younger man with a critical eye. I understand you'll be joining us for Sunday dinner, if the invitation still stands, sir. It does. Sarah's made her mother's roast beef recipe. The ride back to the ranch was slightly awkward, with Thomas asking pointed questions about Samuel's plans for his land and how he intended to make it profitable. Sarah rode slightly ahead, letting the men talk business while silently willing her father not to be too intimidating. At the ranch, Sarah busied herself with the final dinner preparations while the men toured the property. Thomas apparently intent on showing Samuel every fence post and water trough on their land. When they finally returned to the house, both men seemed more at ease with each other, discussing cattle bloodlines with the kind of enthusiasm Sarah had only ever seen her father display with fellow ranchers. Mr. Lawson has some interesting ideas about cross-breeding Herefords with our local stock, Thomas informed Sarah as they sat down to dinner. Thinks it might improve cold tolerance and beef quality. Is that so? Sarah smiled, catching Samuel's eye across the table. And what did you think of Papa's irrigation system, Mr. Lawson? He's quite proud of it. Ingenious, Samuel replied sincerely. I'm hoping to implement something similar on my property, perhaps with some modifications for the hillside sections. The meal progressed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Sarah had dared hope. Her father seemed genuinely impressed with Samuel's knowledge and planning, while Samuel showed real interest in the lessons Thomas had learned through years of ranching in the harsh Oregon climate. After the apple pie had been served and eaten, Thomas pushed back from the table. Sarah, why don't you show Mr. Lawson your mother's garden? It's not much to look at this time of year, but the layout might give him some ideas for his own place. Sarah recognized her father's offer for what it was, a chance for her to speak with Samuel alone, albeit briefly and within sight of the house. I'd be happy to, if Mr. Lawson is interested. Very much so, Samuel agreed, standing to help Sarah with her chair. The late November garden was indeed dormant, with only a few hardy herbs still showing green among the carefully marked beds. Sarah led Samuel along the gravel paths, pointing out what would bloom in spring and summer. Your father is a good man, Samuel observed when they were far enough from the house for privacy. Protective of you. Too protective sometimes, Sarah admitted. But he means well. He should be protective. You're his only child and you've had a difficult few months. Sarah stopped beside the rosemary bush that somehow survived even the harshest winters. I want to thank you again for what you did that day at the church. Not just for speaking up, but for making me see what kind of man Harold really was. Samuel's expression grew serious. I didn't do it to turn you against Willoughby. I just couldn't stand watching you be humiliated for no good reason." "I know." Sarah hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why did you do it? We barely knew each other." "Because I've watched you for longer than you realize," Samuel admitted quietly. "Not in any improper way," he hastened to add, "but I've seen how you treat others in town, always kind, even to those most people ignore, how you help Mrs. Rodriguez with her children when her husband is away working cattle, how you saved that orphaned fawn last spring and raised it until it could return to the wild." Sarah stared at him in surprise. "You noticed all that, like I told you before cowhens see things others don't." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I saw a good person being treated poorly, and I couldn't stay silent." A sharp whistle from the porch broke the moment her father's signal that their private conversation had lasted long enough. "We should head back," Sarah said reluctantly. As they walked toward the house, Samuel spoke softly. "With your father's permission, I'd like to call on you again, perhaps take you for a proper ride next Saturday." "I'd like that very much," Sarah replied, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Thomas Blackburn was waiting on the porch, his expression unreadable as they approached. "Pleasant walk." "Yes, sir," Samuel answered. "Your wife had quite a talent for gardening, from what Miss Blackburn has shown me." "That she did." A shadow of old grief crossed Thomas's face. "Sarah takes after her in that way." Samuel collected his hat from the hook by the door. "Thank you for your hospitality today, Mr. Blackburn." "The meal was excellent, Miss Blackburn," he added with a respectful nod to Sarah. "Before you go, Lawson," Thomas said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly, "Sarah tells me you'd like to call on her again." "Yes, sir, I would, with your blessing." Thomas studied the younger man for a long moment. "You can come for dinner again next Sunday, and if Sarah's agreeable, you can take her riding on Saturday so long as you're back before dark." The smile that broke across Samuel's face was like sunrise. "Thank you, sir. I'll take good care of her." "See that you do," Thomas replied, but there was a hint of approval in his tone that made Sarah's heart soar. As Samuel rode away, Sarah stood beside her father on the porch, watching until he disappeared from view. "He's a good man," Thomas finally said. "Still think you're too young to be serious about anyone, but if you're determined to court, you could do worse than Samuel Lawson." "Thank you, Papa," Sarah replied, slipping her arm through his, "for giving him a chance." Winter descended on Jordan Valley with a vengeance that year, bringing snowstorms that isolated the ranch for days at a time and temperatures that froze water buckets solid overnight. Despite the harsh conditions, Samuel managed to visit the Blackburn Ranch almost every Sunday, sometimes arriving on horseback through snowdrifts that would have deterred a less determined caller. By Christmas, it was clear to everyone in town that Samuel Lawson was courting Sarah Blackburn in earnest. The gossip had shifted from Sarah's broken engagement to speculation about her new relationship, but she found, to her surprise, that the whispers bothered her less and less with each passing week. On Christmas Day, the Blackburns invited Samuel to join them for dinner and the modest gift exchange that had been their tradition since Sarah's mother died. Samuel arrived bearing carefully wrapped packages, a hand-tooled leather journal for Sarah, embossed with her initials, and a fine new hunting knife for her father. "This is too fine a gift," Sarah protested when she unwrapped the journal, running her fingers over the intricate floral design on its cover. "I did the leatherwork myself," Samuel admitted. "My father was a saddle maker back in Missouri, taught me the trade before he passed." Sarah's gift to him was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool that matched his eyes. "So you won't freeze on your rides between our ranches," she explained as he wrapped it around his neck with obvious pleasure. Thomas watched their exchange with a thoughtful expression. After dinner, while Sarah was in the kitchen preparing coffee, he motioned Samuel to join him by the fireplace. "You're serious about my daughter," he said without preamble. Samuel met the older man's gaze directly. "Yes, sir, I am. She's still young, been through a lot this past year." "I know that, Mr. Blackburn. I don't aim to rush her into anything." Thomas nodded slowly. "Good, because if you hurt her, there won't be a place in this territory far enough for you to hide." "If I hurt her, sir, I wouldn't try to hide," Samuel replied with quiet sincerity. "But I don't intend to ever give you cause for concern." When Sarah returned with the coffee tray, she found the two men smoking their pipes in companionable silence, and something in her chest loosened at the sight. January brought a brief thaw, allowing Samuel to finally take possession of his land. Sarah and Thomas rode over to help him survey the boundaries and discuss plans for the spring building. "The house will go here," Samuel explained, indicating a flat area sheltered by pines with a view of the distant mountains. "Nothing fancy at first, just 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. Can always add on later as needed." "What about a barn?" Thomas asked, professionally assessing the layout. "Over there, near the creek but high enough not to flood." Samuel pointed to another clearing. "Thought I'd start with that, actually. Can sleep in the loft while building the house." As her father and Samuel discussed construction details, Sarah wandered toward the creek, imagining how the property would look in spring with wildflowers dotting the meadows and leaves budding on the aspen trees. It was beautiful land, full of potential, and she found herself picturing what it might become in 5 or 10 years' time. "What do you think?" Samuel asked, approaching quietly to stand beside her at the creek's edge. "It's wonderful," she answered honestly. "You chose well." "I had a good feeling about it the first time I rode through." He hesitated, then added, "Even better when I saw it through your eyes." Sarah felt a blush warm her cheeks despite the winter chill. "I think you'll build something special here. I hope to." His gloved hand found hers, squeezing gently. "With the right partner." Before she could respond, Thomas called from the ridge, waving them back. "Storm clouds coming in. We should head back before the weather turns." The moment passed, but Samuel's words lingered in Sarah's mind as they rode home through the gathering dusk, the first snowflakes beginning to fall around them like promises waiting to be kept. February brought another fierce blizzard that trapped the Blackburns in their ranch for nearly a week. When they were finally able to dig out, Sarah convinced her father to ride into town for supplies and to check on neighbors. Samuel was starting work on his barn last week, she reminded him as they loaded the wagon. "We should make sure he weathered the storm all right." Thomas gave her a knowing look, but nodded his agreement. "We'll stop there on the way back from town." Jordan Valley seemed eerily quiet under its blanket of snow, with smoke rising from chimneys the only sign of life. At the mercantile, they found the shelves half empty, the last delivery wagon having been delayed by the storm. "Heard about your gentleman caller, Miss Blackburn," Mrs. Peterson said as she wrapped their meager purchases. "Building himself a nice spread from what my husband says." "Yes, madam," Sarah replied politely. "Mr. Lawson is working very hard." The shopkeeper's expression was speculative. "Working alone, is he? That's a mighty big undertaking for one man." "He'll have help come spring," Thomas interjected. "Miguel from our place and some of the other hands when they can be spared." "Still, it's a lot to manage," Mrs. Peterson persisted, "especially for a man with no family to support him." Sarah knew what the woman was fishing for but refused to give her the satisfaction. "Mr. Lawson is very capable. I'm sure he'll manage just fine." As they left the store, Thomas chuckled under his breath. "You handled that old gossip well." "I've had plenty of practice lately," Sarah replied dryly. Their next stop was the post office, where more surprise awaited. A letter had arrived for Sarah, addressed in her Aunt Eliza's precise handwriting. "What does your aunt want?" Thomas asked as they returned to the wagon. "She hasn't written in over a year." Sarah broke the seal and scanned the contents, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "She heard about the incident at the church. Says I should come stay with her in San Francisco for a while until the unfortunate gossip dies down." She looked up at her father. "She says it would give me a chance to meet more suitable prospects in the city." Thomas frowned deeply. "Eliza always did think she knew what was best for everyone. You don't have to go, Sarah." "I know." She folded the letter carefully. "And I won't. My place is here." The unspoken with Samuel hung between them, acknowledged but not discussed. By the time they reached Samuel's property, the afternoon was waning. Sarah's heart clenched with worry when she saw no smoke rising from the small campsite Samuel had established near his building site. "Samuel," Thomas called as they approached, his voice carrying across the snow-covered meadow. "Lawson, For a terrible moment, there was no response. Then the door of a small, crude lean-to opened and Samuel emerged, unshaven and wrapped in a buffalo robe but very much alive. "Mr. Blackburn, Sarah," he called, trudging through the snow toward them. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Checking on neighbors after the storm," Thomas explained as they climbed down from the wagon. "Good thing we did you look half frozen, boy." Samuel smiled ruefully, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Ran out of firewood 2 days ago. Been keeping warm as best I can." "Why didn't you ride to our place?" Sarah asked, distressed at his condition. "Horse threw a shoe just before the storm hit. Didn't want to risk him in the deep snow." He gestured toward the lean-to. "Been managing all right, though it's not the most comfortable arrangement." Thomas surveyed the situation with a rancher's practicality. "Gather what you need, Lawson. You're coming back with us until this cold snap breaks." Samuel began to protest, but one look at Sarah's worried face silenced his objections. "I'd be grateful, sir." While Samuel collected his few necessities, Thomas loaded the wagon with the supplies they'd purchased in town. "Your young man is stubborn," he commented to Sarah. "Could have frozen to death out here rather than admit he needed help." "He's not my young man yet, Papa," Sarah replied automatically, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Keep telling yourself that if you like, daughter, but I've seen how you look at each other." The Blackburn Ranch welcomed Samuel with warmth and comfort that night. After a hot meal and a chance to clean up and shave, he looked considerably more like himself, though Sarah noted the new leanness to his face and the weariness in his eyes. "You should have come to us sooner," she scolded gently as they sat by the fire while her father dozed in his chair. "Didn't want to impose," Samuel admitted, "and I'm used to managing on my own." Sarah shook her head. "That's not how we do things here. Neighbors look out for each other. Friends even more so." "Is that what we are, Sarah, friends?" His voice was soft, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I'd like to think we're more than that by now," she answered, matching his quiet tone. Samuel reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "So would I." The blizzard's aftermath kept Samuel at the Blackburn Ranch for nearly 2 weeks. Though he insisted on earning his keep helping with chores, repairing winter damage to the outbuildings, and even teaching Sarah some of the leatherworking skills he'd learned from his father, the extended stay allowed for a deepening of their relationship that might otherwise have taken months. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit by the fire while Samuel told stories of his childhood in Missouri or his adventures driving cattle across the territories. Sarah found herself sharing memories of her mother and dreams for her future that she'd never voiced aloud before. Thomas observed their growing closeness with a father's mixture of concern and approval. One evening, finding them talking softly on the porch despite the cold, he cleared his throat meaningfully from the doorway. "Getting late," he commented, "and cold enough to freeze the ears off a brass monkey." "Just heading in, sir," Samuel replied respectfully, though Sarah didn't miss the reluctance in his voice. After Samuel retired to the spare room, Thomas lingered on the porch with his daughter. "You're falling in love with him," he said matter-of-factly. Sarah didn't bother to deny it. "Yes, I think I am, and him with you unless I miss my guess." Thomas sighed heavily. "Just be certain this time, Sarah, be very certain." "I am, Papa." She looked up at the star-filled sky, her breath clouding before her. "With Harold, I was in love with the idea of marriage, of having my own home and family. With Samuel, I'm in love with him, the man himself." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I won't stand in your way, but no rushed engagements this time. You court properly, you hear?" "Yes, sir," Sarah agreed with a smile. "Properly and thoroughly." When the roads finally cleared enough for safe travel, Samuel prepared to return to his property. Loading his few belongings onto his newly shod horse, he thanked Thomas earnestly for the hospitality. "Saved my hide, most likely," he acknowledged. "Won't forget it, sir." "See that you don't," Thomas replied gruffly. "And don't be a stranger. Sunday dinner still stands." Samuel turned to Sarah, who stood wrapped in her shawl against the February chill. "Walk with me to the gate." They strolled slowly across the yard, close but not touching, aware of Thomas watching from the porch. "These 2 weeks," Samuel began, then paused as if searching for the right words. "They've meant a great deal to me, Sarah. To me as well," she replied softly. "I'll be back on Sunday, but it's going to feel like a mighty long time until then." Sarah smiled up at him. "Then you'd best ride safely and quickly back to your land, Mr. Lawson. The sooner you go, the sooner Sunday will come." At the gate, Samuel hesitated, then reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both proper and profoundly intimate. "Until Sunday, Miss Blackburn." Sarah watched him ride away, her hand still tingling from the warmth of his kiss, and knew with absolute certainty that she would never again doubt her heart the way she had with Harold Willoughby. Spring arrived in Jordan Valley with a suddenness that always surprised Sarah, no matter how many years she'd witnessed the transformation. One week the land was locked in winter's grip. The next, tender green shoots were pushing through the soil and buds were swelling on the trees. With the changing season came a flurry of activity at Samuel's property. True to his word, Thomas loaned Miguel and occasionally another ranch hand to help with the barn raising. Several neighboring ranchers, impressed by Samuel's industry and perhaps curious about the man courting Thomas Blackburn's daughter, also offered assistance. Sarah rode over whenever she could, bringing food for the workers and adding her own hands to the labor. She took particular pleasure in helping Samuel plant a small kitchen garden near where the house would eventually stand. "My mother always said a home needs growing things around it," she explained as they worked side by side, tucking seedlings into the freshly turned earth. "Food for the body and flowers for the soul. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Samuel replied, pausing to watch Sarah's deft movements. "I wish I could have known her." "She would have liked you," Sarah said with certainty. "She always valued honesty and hard work above all else." By early April, the barn was completed, a sturdy structure with room for 8 horses, storage for hay and grain, and a comfortable loft where Samuel now made his home. The foundation for the house had been laid out, and the first logs were being prepared for the walls. On a particularly fine Saturday, Samuel invited Sarah for a picnic by the creek that ran through his property. The water was high with spring runoff, the banks lush with new growth, and wildflowers dotted the meadows like colorful stars against the green. They spread a blanket beneath a budding cottonwood tree, and Sarah unpacked the basket she'd prepared: fried chicken, fresh bread, early spring greens, and a berry pie she'd baked that morning. "This is paradise," Samuel declared as they finished their meal, leaning back on his elbows to gaze at the clear blue sky. Sarah followed his gaze upward, watching the delicate new leaves of the cottonwood dancing in the breeze. "It will be when you've finished building." Samuel sat up, his expression suddenly serious. "Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes, I know we haven't been courting all that long by some standards, and I know your father wants us to take our time, which I respect." He took her hands in his. "But I want you to know that I'm building this place with you in mind. Every decision I make, where to put a window, how large to make a room, I find myself wondering what you would want." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Samuel, I'm not asking for an answer today," he continued quickly. "I wouldn't put you in that position again, not after what happened with Willoughby. But I want you to know that when the house is finished, when I can offer you a proper home, I intend to ask your father for your hand." A single tear escaped, trailing down Sarah's cheek. "You don't need to wait until the house is finished." Samuel reached out to brush away the tear with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. "Yes, I do. You deserve a man who can provide for you properly, not ask you to live in a barn loft." "I would live in that loft with you and be happier than in the finest house in Boys with anyone else," Sarah declared with such conviction that Samuel's eyes widened. "You mean that?" "With all my heart." She squeezed his hands. "But I understand why you want to wait, and I respect it." "Just don't make me wait too long, Samuel Lawson." The tenderness in his gaze nearly undid her. "Only as long as it takes to build walls strong enough to shelter you for a lifetime." Later that afternoon, as they rode back toward the Blackburn Ranch, Sarah noticed a wagon approaching from the direction of town. As it drew nearer, she recognized with a start the prim figure of her Aunt Eliza perched on the seat beside the driver. "Oh no," she murmured, pulling her horse to a halt. "What is it?" Samuel asked, stopping beside her. My aunt from San Francisco. Sarah pointed to the approaching wagon. The one who invited me to stay with her. What on earth is she doing here? Looks like we're about to find out, Samuel replied as the wagon drew level with them. Aunt Eliza, a well-preserved woman in her 50s dressed in a traveling suit that screamed of city fashion, peered at them with obvious disapproval. Sarah Blackburn. What are you doing out riding unchaperoned with a? Her gaze swept over Samuel's working clothes. A ranch hand. Sarah straightened in her saddle. Aunt Eliza, what a surprise. This is Mr. Samuel Lawson. Samuel, my father's sister, Mrs. Eliza Montgomery. Samuel tipped his hat politely. Madam, Eliza's lips pinched into a thin line. I received no reply to my letter, Sarah, so I decided to come see for myself how you were faring after that dreadful incident. Now I see my concerns were well-founded. There's nothing improper about our ride, Sarah protested. We're heading back to my father's ranch now. Nevertheless, I shall accompany you. Eliza's tone brooked no argument. Driver, follow these two, please. The awkward procession continued to the Blackburn Ranch, where Thomas was as surprised as Sarah had been to see his sister. Eliza. What brings you all the way from San Francisco? Concern for my niece's reputation and future, Thomas. Eliza descended from the wagon with the driver's assistance, her critical gaze taking in the ranch house and yard. After what you wrote about that disastrous wedding attempt, I felt it my duty to offer Sarah the shelter of proper society. Thomas's expression darkened. I never wrote to you about any wedding. A flicker of discomfort crossed Eliza's face. Perhaps it was Mrs. Peterson then. The details aren't important. What matters is that I'm here now to help Sarah recover from her humiliation and make a fresh start. Sarah dismounted, anger rising in her chest. I don't need a fresh start, Aunt Eliza, and I'm not humiliated. Of course you are, dear. Eliza patted her arm condescendingly. Being rejected at the altar is the worst kind of social disgrace, but in San Francisco, no one need know about it. You can make a completely new beginning. Samuel, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Miss Blackburn wasn't rejected, Mrs. Montgomery. She chose to end an engagement to a man who didn't deserve her. Eliza turned to him as if noticing him properly for the first time. And you are? Samuel Lawson, madam. I own the property adjoining Mr. Blackburn's to the north. I see. Her tone made it clear that she didn't see at all. And your interest in my niece's affairs is. Samuel is courting Sarah, Thomas interjected firmly, with my blessing. Eliza's eyebrows shot up toward her fashionable hat, courting her after the Willoughby debacle. Thomas, have you lost your senses? Perhaps we should continue this discussion inside, Thomas suggested, glancing meaningfully at the ranch hands who were beginning to take notice of the commotion. Sarah, show your aunt to the guest room. Samuel, you're welcome to stay for supper. Thank you, sir, but I should get back to my property before dark. Samuel caught Sarah's eye. I'll call tomorrow after church if that's still agreeable. Very agreeable, she confirmed, her gaze conveying what she couldn't say aloud in her aunt's presence. As Samuel rode away, Eliza watched with narrowed eyes. Really, Thomas, she said loudly enough for Sarah to hear, encouraging another unsuitable attachment so soon. Have you learned nothing? Sarah led her aunt toward the house, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a storm cloud. Eliza Montgomery had never been one to give up easily once she'd set her mind to something, and it was clear she'd set her mind on rescuing her niece from Jordan Valley and from Samuel Lawson. Aunt Eliza's visit stretched from days into weeks, her determination to convince Sarah to return to San Francisco with her growing more evident with each passing day. She criticized everything from the simplicity of the ranch house to Sarah's practical wardrobe, constantly comparing life in Jordan Valley unfavorably to the civilized society of the city. You're wasting your youth and beauty in this wilderness, she declared one evening as they sat in the parlor. In San Francisco, you could attend proper social events, meet eligible gentlemen from good families. I'm perfectly happy here, Aunt Eliza, Sarah replied for what felt like the 100th time. I have no desire to leave. Because of that Lawson fellow, I suppose. Eliza sniffed disapprovingly. Really, Sarah, I expected better judgment from you after the Willoughby incident. At least he came from an established family. Thomas, who had been quietly smoking his pipe by the fireplace, finally intervened. Eliza, that's enough. Samuel Lawson is a fine young man who's building something worthwhile with his own two hands. That counts for more than an established family in my book. You always did have common tastes, Thomas, Eliza replied dismissively. But Sarah deserves better than to be buried alive on some hardscrabble ranch with a man who can barely provide for her. Samuel provides very well, Sarah defended, her patience wearing thin. His land is fertile, his livestock is growing, and he's building a beautiful home. A 2-room cabin, from what I've heard, Eliza countered. Hardly befitting a young woman of your upbringing. My upbringing was right here on this ranch, Sarah reminded her. I've never wanted for anything that mattered. Eliza sighed dramatically. You've been so isolated you don't even know what you're missing. If your mother were alive, don't. Thomas's voice cut through the room like a whip. Don't you dare use Mary's memory to manipulate my daughter. A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, Eliza rose from her chair with wounded dignity. I see I'm not welcome to speak my mind in this house. I'll retire for the evening. After she left, Thomas moved to sit beside Sarah on the sofa. Don't let her get to you, daughter. Your mother would have been proud of the woman you've become and the choices you're making. I know, Papa. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady presence. But why is Aunt Eliza so determined to take me away? Thomas considered the question carefully. Your aunt has always believed that her way of life is the only right one. She married for position and money, not love, and I think she's trying to justify that choice by pushing you down the same path. Were she and Mother very different, like night and day? A smile softened Thomas's weathered face. Mary loved this land almost as much as she loved us. Eliza never understood that. Samuel continued to call regularly, despite Eliza's barely concealed hostility. To his credit, he remained unfailingly polite in her presence, though Sarah could see the strain it caused him to have their courtship subjected to her aunt's constant criticism. One Sunday in late May, Samuel arrived for dinner with news that momentarily silenced even Eliza. The house is nearly finished, he announced as they sat around the table. The roof goes on next week, and then it's just a matter of finishing the interior work. Already? Sarah asked in surprise. I thought you said it would take until late summer. Samuel smiled. I hired extra help from some of the men passing through on their way to the mining camps. Wanted to get it done before the really hot weather sets in. How practical, Eliza commented with faint disdain, though I imagine it's quite primitive compared to what Sarah is accustomed to. It's a solid home, Mrs. Montgomery, Samuel replied evenly. 2 bedrooms, a good-sized kitchen and living area, proper windows with glass panes, and a covered porch that wraps around 2 sides. Even Thomas looked impressed. Sounds like you've gone beyond your original plans, son. Samuel's eyes met Sarah's across the table. I had good reason to. After dinner, while Thomas deliberately engaged Eliza in conversation about their childhood, Samuel and Sarah slipped outside to the porch swing. Is it really almost finished? Sarah asked once they were alone. It is. Samuel took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I've been working from sunup to sundown, and the men I hired have been worth every penny. I can't wait to see it. I was hoping you might ride over tomorrow. Your father mentioned your aunt plans to visit Mrs. Peterson in town. Sarah grinned. Papa's becoming quite the conspirator. He understands what it's like to love someone enough to build a life for them, Samuel replied softly. I've seen how he talks about your mother, even after all these years. The tenderness in his voice made Sarah's heart swell. Samuel, are you going to ask me to marry you when the house is finished? I was planning to ask your father's permission first, he admitted with a slight smile, but yes, that's been my intention all along. Good. She squeezed his hand, because my answer is already yes. Samuel's expression grew serious. Your aunt won't approve, she'll fight it. Let her, Sarah replied with newfound determination. I'm 19 years old enough to know my own mind and heart. I won't let anyone else dictate my future, not Reverend Thornton, not Harold Willoughby, and certainly not Aunt Eliza. The following day, true to her word, Eliza went into town to visit Mrs. Peterson, giving Sarah the perfect opportunity to ride to Samuel's property. As she crested the rise that overlooked his land, she drew her horse to a halt, momentarily stunned by the transformation. Where once there had been only open meadow, a house now stood a sturdy, welcoming structure of golden pine logs with a shake roof and proper stone chimney. The promised porch wrapped around the south and west sides, and glass windows gleamed in the morning sun. Nearby, the barn and several smaller outbuildings created the beginnings of a proper ranch yard, while a split-rail fence enclosed what would eventually become a kitchen garden. Samuel emerged from the barn as she approached, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "What do you think?" he asked when she dismounted. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, taking in every detail, like something from a dream. "Want to see inside?" The interior was simple but thoughtfully designed, with a large main room that would serve as both kitchen and living area. A small bedroom that Samuel explained would be his study until needed for children, and a larger bedroom with a window facing east so you can see the sunrise, he told her with shy pride. Samuel had already installed some basic furnishings, a table and chairs he'd made himself, a sturdy bed frame, and shelves along one wall. "It's not much yet," he acknowledged as they stood in the center of the main room, "but there's a good carpenter in Boys who can make whatever else we need." "It's perfect," Sarah insisted, turning slowly to take it all in. "Absolutely perfect. There's one more thing I want to show you." Samuel took her hand, leading her back outside and around to the east side of the house where a small fenced area contained several saplings. "Apple trees," he explained, "and that one's a cherry. Thought we could start an orchard like your mother had at your home." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Oh, Samuel." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know I said I'd wait until everything was finished, but I can't wait any longer, Sarah. I love you. I've loved you since before that day at the church when I finally found the courage to speak to you. Will you marry me? Will you make this house a home with me?" "Yes," Sarah answered without hesitation, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "1,000 times yes." Samuel pulled her gently into his arms, and their lips met in a first kiss that held all the promise of their future together, tender yet passionate, a perfect beginning. When they returned to the Blackburn ranch late that afternoon, they found Thomas on the porch waiting for them, his expression grave. "Your aunt's looking for you," he warned as they dismounted. "She's in quite a state." Sarah exchanged a glance with Samuel. "We have something to tell you both, actually." Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Let me guess you're engaged." "We'd like your blessing, sir," Samuel said formally. "You have it, son. Though you might want to wait to announce it until the front door flew open and Eliza stormed onto the porch. "There you are. Where have you been all day, Sarah? And with him, I presume?" Her gaze fell to their joined hands and her expression hardened. "What's going on here?" Sarah squared her shoulders. "Samuel has asked me to marry him, Aunt Eliza, and I've accepted." "Absolutely not." Eliza's voice rose sharply. "Thomas, surely you haven't approved this madness." "I have," Thomas confirmed calmly. "They have my full blessing. This is outrageous." "She's barely 19, far too young to make such a decision after the disaster with Willoughby." "I was good enough to marry Harold," Sarah pointed out evenly, "so age clearly isn't the real issue here." Eliza's nostrils flared. "Harold Willoughby was from a respectable family with prospects. This cowboy has nothing to offer you. He has everything to offer me," Sarah countered. "Love, respect, a home he built with his own hands, and a future we'll build together." "A future of hardship and isolation." Eliza turned to Thomas in appeal. "Brother, please reconsider. I'm taking the stage back to Boys next week to connect with the train to San Francisco. Let Sarah come with me, just for a visit. Let her see what other options life holds before she chains herself to this wilderness." Thomas looked between his sister and his daughter, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he spoke carefully. "Sarah is old enough to make her own choices, Eliza. If she wants to visit San Francisco, that's her decision." "Thank you, Papa," Sarah said quietly, "but my place is here with Samuel. I don't need to see San Francisco or any other city to know that." Eliza drew herself up with wounded dignity. "I see I've wasted my time and concern. Very well. When you realize your mistake, don't expect me to welcome you with open arms." With that, she turned and went back into the house, the door closing firmly behind her. "She'll come around eventually," Thomas said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Your happiness is what matters, Sarah." Samuel, who had remained respectfully silent during the confrontation, finally spoke. "Mr. Blackburn, I promise to do everything in my power to ensure Sarah never regrets her choice." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "I know you will, son. Now, let's go inside and see if we can salvage what's left of the day." The week leading up to Eliza's departure was tense, but mercifully brief. She made one final attempt to persuade Sarah to accompany her, pointing out that Jordan Valley didn't even have a proper dressmaker to create a wedding gown. "I don't need an elaborate gown," Sarah replied. "I can make my own dress or wear my mother's. She was married in a simple white cotton that I could easily alter." "A homemade dress for a homemade wedding," Eliza sighed dramatically. "Your poor mother would be heartbroken to see you settling for so little." Thomas, who had been quietly listening, finally intervened. "That's enough, Eliza. Mary would be proud of Sarah for choosing love over appearances. It's what she did when she married me, despite your parents' objections." This silenced Eliza more effectively than any argument could have. The morning of her departure, she embraced Sarah stiffly. "I still think you're making a mistake," she murmured, "but you're my only niece, and I do want you to be happy." "I am happy, Aunt Eliza," Sarah assured her, "truly." As the stage coach disappeared down the road toward Boys, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" she asked her father as they turned back toward home. "Probably not," Thomas admitted, "but that doesn't mean she doesn't care for you in her own way." With Eliza's departure, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Sarah did indeed decide to alter her mother's wedding dress, working carefully to preserve its simple beauty while adjusting it to fit her slightly taller frame. The women of Jordan Valley, many of whom had viewed her with pity or judgment after the incident with Harold, now rallied around her with offers of help and well wishes. "Funny how quickly folks change their tune, Mrs. Peterson commented as she helped Sarah select fabric for curtains for her new home. "But Samuel Lawson has proven himself a man of substance, and that counts for a lot in these parts." "Yes, it does," Sarah agreed, thinking of how Samuel had stood up for her that day on the church steps when no one else would. The wedding date was set for the first Saturday in July, when the wildflowers would be at their peak and the weather reliably warm. Reverend Thornton, perhaps feeling some remorse for his previous judgment, offered the church without hesitation and promised a proper Christian ceremony befitting two young people of good character. As the day approached, Samuel worked tirelessly to complete the finishing touches on their home, while Sarah divided her time between wedding preparations and creating the domestic touches that would transform the house into their home curtains for the windows, quilts for their bed, and a colorful rag rug for the main room floor. The evening before the wedding, Samuel came to the Blackburn Ranch for a final dinner as an unmarried man. After the meal, Thomas excused himself to the barn, giving the couple a few precious moments of privacy on the porch. "Nervous?" Samuel asked as they sat side by side on the swing. "Not about marrying you," Sarah replied honestly, "though I do worry a little about the ceremony itself after what happened last time." Samuel took her hand in his. "This time will be different. For one thing, the groom isn't going to stand silent if anyone objects." Sarah smiled at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "And the bride is absolutely certain of her choice. No regrets about not going to San Francisco. None." She leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the clean scent of soap and pine that clung to him after his work. "My whole world is right here." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union. Sarah woke early, her mother's wedding dress carefully laid out across the chest at the foot of her bed. As she dressed, assisted by Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come to help with her hair, she felt a profound sense of rightness that had been entirely absent on her previous wedding day. "You look beautiful, Mija," Mrs. Rodriguez said when she had finished arranging Sarah's dark hair in a crown of braids interwoven with wildflowers. "Like an angel." Sarah studied her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the confident young woman who gazed back at her. Gone was the uncertain girl who had stood trembling on the church steps last autumn, replaced by someone who knew her own mind and heart with absolute certainty. When Thomas came to escort her to the church, his eyes misted at the sight of her in her mother's dress. "You look so much like her," he said gruffly. "She would have been so proud today." "I feel her with us," Sarah replied softly. The small church was filled to capacity when they arrived, the entire community having turned out for the occasion. As the piano struck up the wedding march, Sarah took her father's arm and began the walk down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Samuel, who waited at the altar. He stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his face freshly shaven, but it was the love shining in his eyes that took Sarah's breath away. This, she thought, is what had been missing with Harold, this absolute certainty that the person waiting for you would move heaven and earth to keep you by their side. Reverend Thornton welcomed the congregation and began the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he had completely revised his opinion of Sarah's readiness for marriage. When he reached the familiar question, if any person present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace, a hush fell over the church. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah was transported back to that terrible day when the Reverend himself had objected. But this time, the silence remained unbroken, and she felt Samuel's hand tighten reassuringly around hers. "Then by the authority vested in me," Reverend Thornton continued with a smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Samuel's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world not as Harold Willoughby's socially acceptable wife, nor as Eliza's fashionable niece in San Francisco, but as Sarah Lawson, partner to a man who had stood with her when it mattered most. The reception that followed at the Blackburn Ranch was a joyous celebration that lasted well into the evening. Even those who had once whispered behind Sarah's back now offered sincere congratulations, won over by the obvious devotion between the newlyweds, and perhaps a little chastened by the reminder that their previous judgments had been proven so thoroughly wrong. As twilight fell, Samuel took Sarah's hand and led her to his waiting wagon, decorated with ribbons and wildflowers by well-wishers. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, the new name rolling off his tongue with evident pleasure. "More than ready, Mr. Lawson," she replied, her heart full to bursting with happiness. The ride to their new home was magical, the summer evening scented with sage and wildflowers, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above them. When they arrived, Sarah gasped in delight to find the porch festooned with lanterns, and the doorway arched with fresh greenery, the work of Miguel and the other ranch hands who had slipped away from the reception early to prepare this welcome. Samuel lifted her easily into his arms to carry her across the threshold, setting her down gently in the main room where a fire had been laid in the hearth and fresh flowers placed in a vase on the table. "Welcome home, Sarah," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Home," she repeated, looking around at the space they would share, the life they would build together. "It's perfect, Samuel, everything I could have wanted." His arms encircled her waist, drawing her close. "I promised myself that day at the church that if I ever had the chance, I would give you everything you deserved, not just a house, but a true home where you would never doubt your worth or your welcome." Sarah reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "You've given me far more than that. You've given me the freedom to be myself, to choose my own path." "And you chose me," Samuel marveled, as if still unable to believe his good fortune. "I chose you," Sarah confirmed, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his, "and I always will." As the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more passionate, Sarah knew that the rejection she had faced on those church steps had been a blessing in disguise, leading her not to the safe, predictable future she had once envisioned with Harold, but to this richer, truer love with a man who saw her clearly and cherished what he saw. In the years that followed, the Lawson Ranch flourished under Samuel and Sarah's joint stewardship. The original house expanded as their family grew, first with the birth of their son Thomas in the summer of 1859, followed by twin daughters Mary and Elizabeth in 1861. A second son, James, arrived in 1864, completing their family. Samuel's careful breeding program produced cattle that thrived in the harsh Oregon climate, while Sarah's orchard became known throughout the valley for its abundant fruit. They worked side by side through good years and bad, their partnership strengthening with each challenge they faced together. Thomas Blackburn remained on his own ranch until rheumatism made the work too difficult, at which point he moved into the expanded Lawson home, sharing his wisdom with his grandchildren and watching with quiet satisfaction as the love between his daughter and son-in-law deepened with the passing years. Jordan Valley itself grew and changed around them, with new settlers arriving and a proper school being built where Sarah occasionally taught when the regular teacher was unavailable. The children who had once whispered about her rejection now sat at her feet learning their letters, the old scandal long forgotten. Reverend Thornton retired to boys, replaced by a younger minister who never knew the story of Sarah's first wedding day. Harold Willoughby and his wife moved to San Francisco after his father's death, their paths never again crossing with the Lawsons. Aunt Eliza did eventually reconcile with her niece, making the journey from San Francisco to attend Thomas's funeral in 1872. Seeing the prosperous ranch and the obvious happiness of Sarah's marriage, she grudgingly admitted that perhaps her niece had made the right choice after all. "Though I still think you would have enjoyed the opera house," she sniffed as she prepared to depart once more. Sarah just smiled, her hand firmly clasped in Samuel's. "Perhaps we'll visit someday," she replied, knowing they probably never would. Their life was here, in the valley that had witnessed both their trials and their triumphs. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Sarah with a special gift, a leather-bound journal with a detailed account of their life together, beginning with the day he had first noticed her at church and culminating with the present day. "I never told you how long I watched you before finding the courage to speak," he confessed as she turned the pages in wonder. "For months, I admired you from afar, telling myself a simple cowhand had no business aspiring to court Thomas Blackburn's daughter. What changed your mind?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Seeing you stand there in your wedding dress, being told you weren't good enough or old enough to make your own choice," Samuel replied, his voice still carrying an edge of indignation after all these years. "I couldn't stay silent, not when I knew what a remarkable woman you are." Sarah closed the journal and placed it carefully on the table before taking her husband's weathered hands in hers. 20 years had added lines to his face and touches of silver to his hair, but his eyes still held the same steadfast devotion that had given her the courage to begin again after her public humiliation. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking a stand that day, tying your fate to mine when everyone else was against us." Samuel's answer was as immediate and certain as it had been the first time he told her he loved her. "Not for a single moment. Standing with you that day was the best decision I ever made." As they stood on the porch of the home they had built together, watching their children tend to evening chores in the yard below, Sarah reflected on how different her life might have been if Reverend Thornton hadn't objected to her marriage to Harold, if Samuel hadn't found the courage to speak up when everyone else remained silent. Sometimes, she mused, what seems like rejection is actually life's way of redirecting you to where you truly belong. And as Samuel's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close against the gathering evening chill, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be beside the man who had promised to stand with her, and who had kept that promise through all the seasons of their life together.